Welcome everyone. We're going to give a couple seconds to let everyone into the webinar today. Welcome. We're glad you're able to join us today for our next edition of the 49er Industry Chats. My name is Noemi Guevara, and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement here at Cal State Long Beach. Before we start our session today, I want to let you know that this session is being recorded for future viewing. We encourage you to use our Q&A box below to submit any questions to our guest speaker today. And now I would like to introduce our moderator, Lucia Calls, who graduated in 1975 from the College of Liberal Arts with a degree in Spanish and was recognized as a distinguished alumna in 2005 and now currently serves on our CSULB Alumni Council Board. Thank you so much, Lucia, for joining us today and moderating our great chat. So now I turn it over to you.
Great to be here. Let me introduce Bill Coulter. He's a proud alum and earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Long Beach State. During his career, he worked in a number of areas, including corporate lending, investment banking, trade and commodity finance, and private equity. With more than 37 years experience, he held various leadership roles, including principal at Knightsbridge Advisers LLC, vice president at Dresdner Bank, director of commodity finance at Swiss Bank Corporation, and vice president at the Chase Manhattan Bank. His career took him around the country and the world, opening doors to live in New York and abroad in London and Hong Kong. In addition to CSULB, he holds degrees from the London School of Economics and Political Science, University of Colorado, and Thunderbird School of Global Management. Bill is also a proud CSULB parent. Joining us today from Tucson, Arizona, please welcome Jim Coulter.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm live, I guess.
Yes, you are.
Am I supposed to talk? Okay, well, listen. Yes, and it's Bill Coulter from Tucson, Arizona, where I'm happily retired, having spent a lot of time on the move. And one might think, as they look back on their career, that it was well planned, that you were in control, you did the right things, and to a certain extent, maybe that is the case for some people. I would describe my career as less planned than more taking advantage of opportunities. And I don't want to underplay the role that good fortune, chance, luck plays in one's life. And of course, you deal with all the rough and the smooth, but in my case, I've been very fortunate. And I think that's really something that started well before I was a freshman at Long Beach State, with a great family, a good education that prepared me for my university days. But Long Beach State was the foundation that I built upon for another several years, studying in different places, traveling, and finally going to the Thunderbird School of Global Management. That was sort of the last key in my sort of education, and that got me my job in New York with the Chase Manhattan Bank. But I want to say something that is really profound, and that's because I'm quoting somebody, okay? And it's, I haven't fact-checked the quote, but it's attributed to Warren Buffett. Many of you may have never heard the name of Warren Buffett, but he is considered one of the most successful investors, business persons in the world. I think he's the 7th wealthiest with about $80 billion of personal wealth. So he's obviously done some things right, and he's obviously spent his life working in business and finance. But a quote from him is the following: in looking for people to hire, you look for 3 qualities: integrity, intelligence, and energy. And if they don't have the first, the other 2 will kill you. Now, it's interesting because coming from the financial sector, I like to tell people I worked in banking before we blew the world up. Okay, before the problems that sort of affected the economy that were driven in part by banks gone crazy. But the fact is, the environment, the financial services industry has been in development for many, many years. and it's gone through lots of different stages. And we're all living now in a very difficult time from a financial standpoint. And I don't claim to have any answers to the difficult questions that we all face, but I'll tell you a little bit about sort of what I think you can look forward to. And that is, take the opportunity that you're given now at Long Beach State, pardon me, Cal State, Long Beach, CSULB. To me, it's always Long Beach State. And be curious. You're going to end up probably in more than one career. You're going to have at least one core competency, maybe two. But I would say on the edges, it's very beneficial to develop broader skills than maybe just your major, whether it's writing, whether it's speaking, whether it's a knowledge of politics, history, the world. All of these things will, I think, provide you with a perspective that will help you. It'll basically make you a better citizen, a better person. I was very fortunate. When I first went to Long Beach State as a freshman, I had no idea what I was going to study. I ended up in political science in part because my sister, who was ahead of me, was in political science. I had no idea that I would study in London, but my sister had returned from a year abroad in Europe, and that kind of set me up. And I think that year in London, which was made possible by Long Beach State, by the way, I would not have been able to do it without the full support of the faculty in the political science department, because at that time, Long Beach State did not have a program to go overseas. We had to create one. We had to bring me back with a full year's worth of credits. So I am extremely thankful. And I hope that in the years ahead, as your careers evolve and you go through various things, when you get to my stage in life, you'll look back and you'll say, well, I got a great start at Long Beach State and I built upon it. I built a career and a life. And whether you move around the world or stay put in Long Beach or nearby, that's not important. Just stay curious and continue to keep involved. I guess that's my message.
While we're at it, when you talked about that London internship, how did that, can you kind of talk?
Well, what happened is, it's very interesting because my sister had studied in Europe, of all places, Denmark. I wasn't about to go to Denmark. You have to remember, this is the mid-60s. This is the British invasion. This is Carnaby Street, which the young folks on this call will not have any knowledge of, but it was sort of the fashion center of the sort of world. And I was also coming from California. It was the Beach Boys. It was surfing. I had the two best locations to live and study in, and I was blessed. But what happened is I applied to go to 5 different universities in the UK because they did have what they call a general application, because they wanted to have foreign students. They thought foreign students added to their educational sort of experience. And guess what? I paid nothing to go to the London School of Economics and Political Science. At that time, probably 10% of the students in the UK went on to university or college. It was not a very common thing. And so they all had full ride scholarships. All I had to pay for was my transportation over, my living expenses, and my 3 months traveling in Europe. And I did the entire 11 months on $3,500. So you don't think I feel lucky? But no, I was first accepted at the University of Edinburgh, and I said, I'm going. But when the London School of Economics popped up, it was in my sort of sweet spot in terms of my focus on my education. And going to London in the 60s, it was just what they say, a no-brainer. I had to take it. So I went, I took a charter flight. I flew across from New York City, and I never looked back. And today I still have friends from my LSE days, including, by the way, one graduate law student who went on to be a very prominent QC, which is Queen's Counsel, which is the highest level you can reach before you become a judge. And he now sits in the House of Lords. So I'm not saying I'm in his league. I am not, but I met some very interesting people. I still keep in touch with them. And the best thing I did was maintain a whole bunch of friendships over my life, planning or traveling and living in foreign places. So it's really been sort of my one driving force. Rather than finance, my driving force was travel, dealing with various people in various locations, and I was able to combine the two.
So let me ask you, how did you make the jump from political science to your sweet spot of economics?
Well, that was very interesting. I still went on. I got another scholarship to go to the University of Colorado. By this time, I was married. Here, another thing that's lucky in life. My wife and I met in high school, and we got married when I graduated from college 4.5 years later. So we both headed off to the University of Colorado, where for 2 years I had a scholarship, and I continued to study political science. I realized at the end of that 2 years that if I was going to get a job, I probably needed to move more towards the private sector and the business sector. My one opportunity was to work for the government, to go to the University of Pittsburgh and get another degree, master's in public administration, and go to work for HUD. At that point, I said, I'm going to go to Thunderbird. I was aware of the school, I knew about it. And so I took out student loans. Cheryl and I moved to Arizona, and I spent 1 year immersed in accounting, management, language, everything that would position me to get a job. And by the way, I was very fortunate. I got a job in New York City, but I wanted to work in New York City. I had traveled back and forth. I knew the city. I said, if I'm going to start in finance, I want to start in what I considered the center of it, which was New York City. And I got that opportunity. But I went to Thunderbird for a very practical reason. I needed a job.
Wow. So, and from that came the rest, right?
Yeah, from that came the rest. And it, like I say, it wasn't so much planned. I wanted to go overseas, and they were hiring because the banks were expanding, but I never dreamt that I would have a chance to go to London. It came up and I grabbed it. And I grabbed the chance to go to Hong Kong. Believe me, I had never had any interest or knowledge of Asia. And after 2 years in Hong Kong, where I traveled all over the sort of Asia, from Indonesia to Singapore to Philippines, Korea, Japan, even spent 2 weeks in China, or a week in China and a week in Japan on a vacation. This is something that my wife, Cheryl, planned. All the trips into China back in those days, Mao had just died. This was very early on. All the trips into China for tourists had to start in Hong Kong. Well, we were there. So we spent a week in Beijing and then days in Tokyo and Kyoto. So it was really just opportunity. It came up, I grabbed it, and then I made the most of it.
So what was that year?
That would have been left to Hong Kong in 1976. In fact, when I got to Hong Kong, I was ahead of my family. By this time we had 2 children, one born in New York City, one born in I guess in London, right? Yeah. And I got to the hotel, and within the first couple of days, we had Tropical Storm Ellen. It rained 24 inches in 24 hours. And I said to myself, what have I got myself into? And very shortly thereafter, Mao died. And again, this is all very much history, not maybe relevant to today, but at that time, it was a major cataclysmic event. And I'm just saying to myself, is Hong Kong the right place to be? It was a fantastic place to be. Asia was on the bubble. From an economic and finance standpoint, it was better to be in Asia at that time than, say, Latin America, that was going through financial crises.
So you're at the head of the wave then.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's so interesting because my wife and I went back to Hong Kong in 2013 for a wedding. Again, the son of one of our friends that we made in Hong Kong. We had a great reunion. We spent 10 days in Hong Kong and then went into China. And the place had been transformed. And of course, it breaks my heart to see what's going on in Hong Kong these days, both politically and in terms of just the demonstrations and also the COVID. So I feel very fortunate. My timing was, again, not my timing. It just happened to be, I was in the right place at the right time.
Now, did you find that your political science, the studies really helped you make the connections globally?
Well, I think it did. And the other thing is, as soon as I found out I was going to London, I immediately took courses in UK history or British history, English history. And I immersed myself in history. And so I think it's not a minor, but in addition to all my finance and I'm thinking math courses, and at one time I was taking math and chemistry and physics. Basically, I have a great deal of interest in other countries. And so I'm open to sort of their thoughts, their views. And even this day, I get a lot of my news through BBC World News and the BBC Radio, in part because while they focus a lot on Britain, where I lived for 9 years off and on, and where our daughter was born, they also have a very global view. You can find out what's going on in different parts of the world because it is world news, where in the States, we tend to be very focused on ourselves.
Now, Bill, we've got quite a few questions, but
Sure.
before I've got my history book, so I would just maybe as a point of reference, when was China opened? Because for a lot of our viewers or listeners, they didn't realize that China was closed to the world.
Oh, yes. Well, during the Nixon administration, his great achievement with Kissinger was making a sort of détente with the Chinese. And this goes back to the early 70s.
Yeah.
No, actually, yes, it was the early 70s, because I went into China with Cheryl in 1978. And the young lady that drove us around and took us places, our guide, because I was with a group of people, she was seen in a video not that long afterwards showing the foreign secretary from the United Kingdom around. In other words, we were treated like VIPs because we were an emerging class of tourism. They didn't even know what to do with us. But no, China just opened. It had been closed and sort of an enemy, Russia, China, they were communists. So until the Nixon administration opened up China, there were no Americans traveling in there. So it was at the very beginning.
Yeah, because I think that historical reference is really important about.
Of course, I forget. I'm talking about a 50-year period of time here, and I'm jumping around a lot. But
no, that's okay.
70s.
I wanted to kind of share that. So we've got quite a few questions. So what are some of the lessons learned from working abroad?
Well, I guess, first of all, it's a challenge. I've been very fortunate because my wife has stayed with me for 52 years. And I've taken her a lot of different places, and it's a challenge for both of us. You're far away from home. You might be working in a place where you don't speak the language, at least initially, very well. In my case, I was fortunate. I lived and worked in places where English was the language. And the other thing is, I simply say that you have to be open-minded. You have to accept sort of the way things are. I remember I went to the Philippines to an important meeting, and it was supposed to take place at, I don't know, 6 o'clock, say. And I went down to the lobby of the hotel to be met at 6 o'clock. The guy showed up at 7. And you know, the thing was, he didn't say, "I'm sorry, I'm late." He was on Philippine time, okay? You just had to get used to that. And when you then went to Korea, Korea back then was a developing country. I remember my first landing in Korea, I thought I was in a 1950s black and white movie. It was the middle of winter. Everything was cold and frozen. There was one hotel that the foreigners stayed in. Now it's a bustling, dynamic, economy. So I think it's basically what you have to do is be very open-minded and accepting and take the rough with the smooth, because you're going to find that you're always comparing it to the way it was back at home. Is it better? Is it worse? No, it's different. It's simply different.
So along those same lines, because you did say that you had, in terms of language, how important to know the local language when working abroad? And could you speak the language in Hong Kong?
Well, of course, it was Chinese, Cantonese, but English, because of the British presence, was the real language of business. And it's interesting. I went to a Chinese wedding a month or so after I got to Hong Kong, and I thought, oh, this would be great. I'm going to see this kind of very different Chinese wedding. And the bride and groom spoke in English because they couldn't speak to each other in Chinese. One spoke Mandarin and one spoke Cantonese. Although the language was written in the same way, they couldn't speak the same language. Now, the other thing I will mention, I developed an interest in languages late. I had to take language as part of my master's, and I had to take language, obviously, at Thunderbird. And then I was given the opportunity to take French classes in New York and in London, because I traveled to France a lot. So my language, my living language was French, and I was, basic. I could enjoy chatting, conversing in hotels and cab drivers, but I never, ever conducted business in a foreign language. And here's was the advantage I had as an American. English was the business language. Wherever you went, yes, you found people that couldn't speak English, but the business that I conducted in my level of finance was always conducted in English. And in fact, the law that governed the agreements that we signed, very complicated law, loan agreements, were either in New York law or English law. So I had an advantage. I wish at one point that I'd gone to a country where I didn't speak the language and I could really develop a fluency, because I think once you've learned another language, you'll know this so well. When you start to learn another language, you think about your own language differently, and you start to appreciate the differences and the subtleties and the way they express things. So I'm all for learning other languages. It's just that I had 4 years of Latin in a college prep high school. And by the time I got to Long Beach State, I was a little burnt out on languages. So I didn't jump into the language stream. And in some ways, I regret that.
Well, it was like by fire, right? You're
Yes.
kind of feet first.
Yes.
I think that because I'm a history buff, I know that, like, for example, the language of the world was French
Absolutely.
for the longest time. And so then all of the business, and laws was in that term. And then it went into English, but from the British
Yes.
perspective. So
Right.
I think you're right about the language, but the other thing is just how much of the history is important, learning their history of the places that you're working in.
I think it's critical. And, I would even say perhaps more recent history than, the kings and queens of the Middle Ages. But understanding, when I arrived in London, it was 1966. It was literally just 2 decades after the Second World War. And the Americans were obviously the saviors, or considered the saviors. All the Americans were appreciated and well loved. But England had gone through some really difficult times. And I appreciated the fact that when I took on that study of the UK history, I chose to study from 1600 through to modern times. And then I continued to study it at the LSE, because it gave me much more appreciation about the parliamentary system of government, the different parties. Again, this was my sort of interest to start with. But by understanding that and living amongst, I lived in a dorm or a hall, about 400 men at the time. There were only 5 Americans. The others were from all over the Commonwealth for the most part. And I met friends from Rhodesia that became Zimbabwe, and friends from, not necessarily friends, but I met other fellow students from China, okay, the Middle East, South America. So it was an opportunity to just sort of, I'm a globalist, okay? I don't know whether I was born a globalist, but I've become one. I appreciate the fact that we've got one globe and we're all interdependent and we all need to pull together on global issues. And that's just where I come from, and that's where I'm staying. But I appreciate the fact that a study of history is absolutely, I think, critical for everybody, whether you're in education or politics or business. An understanding of history is key.
Now, there's a question here about why did you find it was important to keep earning degrees? Were they required for what, your goal, your ultimate goal was?
It's interesting. Education has been the key to my whole life. When I went to college, I was the second one in my family to go to college, although my dad did earn his college degree on the GI Bill. So maybe I was the third, but he got it in night school as an adult working full time. So he wanted my sister and myself and my younger brother to all get college educations. And in each one of our case, it's the key to our future lives. But the reason I went to graduate school, quite frankly, I didn't have a clue what I was going to do when I graduated in Long Beach State, but I knew I wanted to continue studying, and I didn't want to stay in California. So the only schools I applied to were in Colorado, Chicago, New York, and Washington. And guess what? I got accepted at 2 or 3, but I got a full scholarship to go to the University of Colorado. So I went for it. So it wasn't so much that I had a plan, but at that time, I thought that it would probably help me to have a degree. My decision to go to Thunderbird was, again, very pragmatic. I needed a job.
Right.
Yeah.
And that, I guess the thing for some of our students and alum that are listening, it is important to be as competitive on paper
Oh,
when you're out there, because you're competing with,
yes, when I got, in fact, I guess it was February of this year, just before the COVID hit, I was in Florida on a vacation with my wife, and I had a lunch with the gentleman at Chase who hired me. He had been a more senior guy in the bank, and he's a bit older than me, and he went on to great success in his chosen field, which was finance. And I remember saying, his name was Bob Hunter. I remember saying to Bob, you know, I feel so lucky that you hired me. I mean, you had a lot of people to hire and you chose me. So it was a bit of chance. And he kind of said, well, no, you were well qualified. And I said, well, you were hitting me with these complicated accounting questions, because he was coming at me. This wasn't a softball interview. He was asking me all sorts of things. And of course, I had had a year's worth of accounting, and I was very much into math, calculus, and all this other stuff. So I handled all that very well. And I said to him, you know, and he said, well, I didn't hire you. I just gave you an opportunity to go to New York. You could have blown it in New York. So I guess I didn't blow it in New York. But the bottom line is, I just basically think that you can't have too much education, but you understand at some point you've got to go from unless you're going to get a PhD, stay in the academic world, teach, research, you've got to move out into the private sector or the public sector. And so I don't think you can have too much education.
now we had it's a good segue, because what advice do you have for those interested in the finance industry? What qualities and skills do you think are necessary to thrive in that field?
Well, you know, it's interesting. And until I switched from political science to business, I was really into math. I had 5 or 6 years of math in high school, and then I took calculus and physics and chemistry. And I guess in terms of the financial world today, it's much more driven, I would say, by technology than when I was first in finance. But an understanding of finance, and again, I'm going to move this back to your personal life as well. A basic understanding of finance, even if you don't go into the financial sector, is a requirement to manage your own life, whether it's your personal finances. And I guess my view is, by getting an MBA, that used to be the ticket, because you got an MBA and that gave you the opportunity to interview with the major players. Right now, I would say, if you're key to go into the financial services sector and you want to get a jump or a head start, a financial emphasis in your degree and an MBA is probably almost a requirement. And you know, I don't say that lightly, because I don't want people to think that they've got to follow a certain path. They may also want to get some work experience and then go back and earn an MBA part-time. But I just think that the world is so competitive. And if you want to start, I also feel starting with a large firm was a big help for me, because I established my background and my credentials working for the Chase Manhattan Bank for 21 years. That gave me the opportunity to work for Swiss Bank, Dresdner, and Knightsbridge. Without that sort of foundation, and the education is key to get started, but after that, it becomes less important as long as you stay engaged. You've got to keep in other words, as technology changes, you've got to stay with the technology. As new laws and rules and regulations come into play. So I'm hard pressed. In fact, when I first talked to Cynthia about an industry chat, I said, you know, I left the industry 10 years ago and it's changed so much. I spent a lifetime working in an industry where you stood in line to deposit a check. And now this weekend, I got a check and I deposited it on my phone. Okay. So the fact of the matter is, in the retail sector, it's totally changed. The other thought that I'll just leave with those that are listening is, I spent most of my time working for financial institutions, but I worked with the clients of the financial institutions. I was, quote, a relationship manager. I was in charge of marketing for the globe. I did these things because I enjoyed reaching out to people that needed what we were, quote, offering. So I had to understand all of the products and all of the competitive advantage, we had, whether it was trade finance, commodity finance, private equity, and at the same time, sort of differentiate ourselves. But I enjoyed working with our clients. I don't know to what extent that's of interest. Some people just want to get into finance. They want to be a trader. They want to use their analytical skills. They want to model. That is very different than from what I did. I took my financial skills and built a career in as much marketing and sales as I did in the discipline itself. I was not an accountant. I didn't earn a CPA, but I used the tools and the knowledge of financial analysis to allow me to move from one organization to the other.
Bill, you're right on target here in terms of a segue into the next question, but I'll preface it by saying what you just said. How important are relationships and networking? So here's the question with that overarching piece. You held many leadership roles at top banks. What did you do to make yourself known in the banking industry? Between roles, promotions, how did you know it was time for the next opportunity?
Well, it's really interesting. When I was working for Chase and bouncing around the globe, I was lucky enough to be at a time where the banks were expanding, okay? And so I tended to get jobs because of the people I worked for. I worked for some great people, some really talented people. And as long as you built your reputation within the organization, you had a chance to move from New York to London to Hong Kong and back to London. When I went to Hong Kong, I never thought I'd see London again, but I had a chance to go back and set up a whole new division because of my track record. And the thing is, when I moved to Swiss Bank, I'll be honest with you, I moved because someone from Chase had moved to Swiss Bank and was setting up a department, and he hired people from, among other places, Chase. So another thing I would say is, don't burn bridges, leave on good terms. And even if you have a reason to feel you've been, say, overlooked or mistreated or whatever, you want to maintain a sense of civility. And that has helped me over the years. But my last position at Knightsbridge was working for a gentleman that I had met in London in the 1970s. And I went to work for his firm in the 1990s. And I can't say I worked hard to keep all these relationships up, but when I needed them, I was able to, shall we say, turn to them. And I got all of my positions through networking, every one of them. It wasn't, going online or monster.com. It was people that I met. And the other good thing is at least, and again, I don't want to make this just financial services. It could be education. It could be business in general. If you're going to be moving around, and everyone on this call either moved around or will be moving around, because that's the nature of the world we live in today, you're going to do it through personal connections that you develop through just staying engaged, not locking yourself down and just thinking about the immediate task. You just have to think about a big picture. And so I was working in syndications. I knew all the banks because Chase was a leader. I knew all the people in all the banks. So I was in a position of, I was what did they give me a title? I was the chairman of the subcommittee on export finance for the American Bankers Association in London. And it was at a time where the export credits were being shifted to dollars from pounds. And so I was sitting down with top executives in the clearing banks and so forth. So I just was given this opportunity by where I was. It was sort of again, I feel very blessed because it could have been different, but it worked out so well for me.
So you talked about contracts and using English law for some of the agreements that you worked on. Yeah. You just mentioned that. Can you give us an example of some of that work? What did a day look like for you?
Well, let's go back to again, this is history. This is a history lesson. When I first moved to London, I was working for a consortium bank that Chase partly owned, and we were doing a North Sea financing. And this was when oil was at a higher price and it was economic to drill and put in platforms in the North Sea. So we were going to finance a platform. It was called the Frigg Field. and it was between Norway and the UK. And we were going to put this in and finance it with a big syndicated loan. Unfortunately, at this time, the French were driving it because the buyers of the gas involved the French. But the day before or the week before, the platform tilted and had to be repositioned. And I was syndicating a loan where we put out a loan agreement with all sorts of covenants and restrictions in it. And the law at the top said to be determined, because the French were not willing to accept English or US law, which eventually they had to get the loan finished. But all of these loan agreements had what we call covenants in them, restrictions, how the money was going to be used, not just what the charge was or when it was going to be paid back, but the kind of financial standing that they had to maintain. And this particular field, by the way, the gas was partially owned by the French and developed by the French and the Norwegians. It was being sold almost in its entirety to the British. So here you go. You had this multinational, multi-country, and it was a very complicated loan agreement. It ended up successful, and I'm happy to say, I like to say I never made a loan that went bad. You know, that's probably not a correct statement, because when you do enough loans, particularly to countries and mega financings, they get rescheduled. And so I got involved in some that had to be rescheduled. But at the end of the day, these loan agreements required fast thinking, and I worked with some tremendous lawyers who would sit there and draft in front of you, because you'd get all these comments coming from the syndicate of banks. They wanted this change, they wanted that change. Then you'd have to go back to the borrower. So it was just a fast-paced, exciting place to be. I'm not a lawyer, okay? I'm not cut out to be a lawyer, but I have a great appreciation for the work they do in getting a business agreement put into a document that works.
And I would think that the history and also what's going on socioeconomically and politically in with the countries you're working with.
Yeah, you know, it really is interesting because, for example, Germany has been considered the engine that drives Europe, okay, because of their economy. Of course, their economy had a head start. During the Second World War, their economy was destroyed, and through the Marshall Plan, they rebuilt it. And by the way, the Germans are very thrifty, hardworking people, a lot of education, a lot of internships, a lot of, shall we say, opportunities to go to work. But you know, the interesting thing about Germany, I don't know what it's like today. When a German buys a car, they pay cash. They never borrowed to buy a car. They saved up for it and they paid cash, and then they started saving for their next car. Now, possibly that's coming out of the hyperinflation that their parents and grandparents experienced.
Right.
But the bottom line is very different than dealing with, shall we say, other countries that are not as, shall we say, focused on thrift. And so, again, I keep coming back to personal finances. I tell my children, even my grandchildren, it's not how much money you make. You want to do something that you're passionate about, that you enjoy. It's what do you have left over at the end of the year. And I don't expect anyone who's young, who's paying off student loans and who's getting started in life, maybe getting married and raising a family, to be able to save a lot of money. But at the end of the day, live within your means and to try to start saving early, because it will make a whole lot of difference when you look back over your life, to be able to relax and not, and again, I feel very fortunate. Right now, I haven't lost a job because I retired, but I know there's many people out there that are suffering because of the economic situation that affects not just the US, but the world.
Now, there's another question from someone who is not returning to college, but what are the best ways to learn about finance if you're not going back to like university?
Well, you know, that's interesting. I actually believe in continuing education, okay? Whether it's taking a course at a junior college or a four-year college, I truly believe that you almost have to recycle back into it. I'm not going to recommend books or specific courses, but I do know this, and it's tough now with all of the restrictions on travel and remote learning and so forth, but working with a finance professor, and again, I think accounting is essential. It's sort of like the foundation. You have to have a basic understanding of accounting without getting a CPA and going into accounting, because I consider that to be relatively boring. Apologies to all accountants, okay? It's the financial analysis that comes from understanding accounting. But when you get into finance, you get into all of the complicated derivative products that have been developed over the last 20, 30 years. And those, I simply believe, a good solid background in economics as well. Economics and finance are interrelated to the point where you need to understand both. Again, not have a degree in economics, but at least understand macro and microeconomics and some of the basic fundamentals of the discipline.
So where would they go for this if they're not going back to university?
Oh, geez. You know, can I say I don't know?
Yeah, okay,
Because the thing is, I guess online, here's the other thing. There is so much online learning these days. And I think some of it is actually not expensive or free, but of course, it may be informal and it may not give you a degree or a piece of paper. But I guess I would have to do some research. Obviously, I'm not thinking of doing this. And I don't think there's anyone in my family that has the interest in finance that I have had. But I would think that online learning, but again, I don't know whether it's going to be a university or a private school or whatever, could be an opportunity. But I'm stumped. I really don't know, other than getting a formal, shall we say, course with a syllabus that meets your interests in terms of what you want to learn about finance.
Now, there's a very specific question here, not related to that. Please explain what syndicated loans are.
What a definition of them?
Yes.
Okay, well, basically what happens is when you have to raise $100 million or $1 billion, but a large amount of money, an individual bank prudently can't lend that amount of money. They have legal lending limits. So what they do is they reach an agreement with a borrower and they get a mandate to raise financing on specific terms and conditions. They then go out and offer this opportunity to lend to other banks where they feel that they're interested in participating. Now, I came from big banks that were lead banks. Not always. I would sometimes participate in someone else's loan, but my job was to win mandates from borrowers and arrange loans larger than the institution I was working for, particularly when I was in the investment banking business in Hong Kong and London. We didn't have a big balance sheet. So we arranged loans, and we did, on one case, we would do what we call an in-house syndication. Orion Bank, who I worked for, would arrange a loan and they would sell participations to the shareholders, Chase Manhattan Bank, Royal Bank of Canada, NatWest, Westdeutsche Landesbank, Credito Italiano, and Mitsubishi Bank. We had banks in all these different countries. So we would do what we called an in-house syndication. But when they got very big, you would have to offer the loan, and you didn't have necessarily a legal commitment to do more than what you were committing on your own balance sheet. But this is typical in the marketplace, and it still happens today. Large loans have to be shared among banks.
Now, I have one last question because we've got a couple minutes.
Yep.
When you first started out, you mentioned about in your lifetime, you will probably get one or two basic core competencies that you use. And I'd like to know what yours are.
Well, obviously, it started out in terms of a general education, a broad education, but my core competency was focused on finance and banking, because that's what I went to Thunderbird to get an opportunity to work in the banking field, because I thought that was an opportunity to travel and live abroad. So I was picking banking as my first area of interest. My second area was private equity. And I got into that really at a time when it was more my relationships, my knowledge of Europe, and my previous travel gave me a track record to raise money. So what happened is I went from lending money to raising money. So my core competency was meeting with institutional investors that didn't understand private equity and needed a sort of an intermediary to work with them. And so we would pool together funds raised, sometimes as much as 50 million or 25 million, and put it into a fund that was 500 million. And then we would invest that. I wasn't on the investment side, I was on the money raising side. But again, I think of myself as a generalist. I have always thought that, because I have never been able to become a scientist focusing on finding a cure for cancer, or focusing on a career in politics. I've been all over the place geographically and in terms of my travel. So it's maybe a different life than some people would aspire to, but for me, it's worked.
You know what? We've gone 1 minute overtime.
Oh.
So I'm probably going to get my hands spanked. But
Okay,
that's
absolutely. Well, thank
Any
you.
last words? Just a couple last
Well,
words.
just two things. If you want a Netflix documentary, Inside Bill's Brain, which is about Bill Gates, Melinda Gates, and the foundation, an excellent program. And if you're interested in finance and you want to know something about the history of finance, The House of Morgan. And the author is the same gentleman that wrote the biography on Alexander Hamilton. So if you know anything about Alexander Hamilton, Ron Chernow wrote another book called The House of Morgan. Those two, that book and the documentary, one's about finance and the other's just simply inspirational. You will be inspired.
Hey, I really enjoyed this conversation.
And I did as well. I did as well. I'm glad to have chatted, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Lucia, for a wonderful chat. And thank you, Bill. Before you go, is there a way that people could connect with you on LinkedIn, social media?
You know, it's interesting. I would say the best way to connect with me is email. And I don't mind anyone having my email. And the reason I say that is I'm overwhelmed. I'm drowning in, shall we say, references and text messages and what have you. But if anybody wants to contact me by email, I'm more than happy to follow up if there's any questions or issues. And so that's the best way. I do have a Facebook page, but again, I'm drowning in friends and my daughter's friends and my wife's friends. So I don't even necessarily look at it.
Right.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to email Bill, contact us at our alumni website or email, and we'll get you in contact with Bill. Thank you again so much. Again, if you want to visit our website, this session was recorded and it will live on our website at csulb.edu/alumni. And you could follow us on social media to learn about future programs like this. So we thank you so much for joining.